Professor Zar'Kax smoothed down his iridescent neck frills and adjusted his academic robes for the fourth time that morning. The prestigious halls of the Central Galactic University demanded nothing less than perfection, and as the head of advanced planetary physics, he had a reputation to maintain. Another day of molding the galaxy's finest minds, he hummed to himself, his secondary breathing holes whistling slightly as he settled into his ergonomic hover chair. The morning light from the binary stars streamed through his office windows, casting dancing patterns across the collection of awards that lined his walls. He reached for his data pad, ready to begin his usual morning routine of reviewing student submissions. The familiar motion was interrupted by an urgent ping from his teaching assistant, Blextra. The young Centaurian's message simply read, "Professor, you need to see this immediately." What could possibly be so urgent? Zar'Kax muttered, his dorsal spines bristling with mild irritation. He opened the attached file, expecting perhaps another case of quantum plagiarism, or maybe even a mathematical proof gone horribly wrong. What he found instead made his all four eyes blink rapidly in succession. This cannot be correct," he whispered, his voice crackling with disbelief. The homework submission in question came from the university's first and only human student. The solution to what should have been a straightforward planetary orbital mechanics problem was anything but standard. Where other students had submitted neat, 30-page proofs using the accepted galactic standard calculation methods, this Amanda Brooks, had turned in 2 pages. 2 pages. And the methodology? It was practically barbaric. "Computer, verify these calculations," Zar'Kax commanded, his primary heart beginning to race. The room's AI hummed briefly before responding. "Calculations verified, Professor. Results are accurate within 0.00001% margin of error." Zar'Kax slumped back in his hover chair, causing it to bob slightly. But she used, what did she call it? A back-of-the-envelope calculation. What envelope? This is madness. He quickly pulled up Amanda's previous assignments. Each one showed the same patterned bizarre shortcuts, primitive approximations, and yet consistently correct results. How could someone from a level 12 Deathworld possibly? His train of thought was interrupted by another ping, this time from Professor Nax's tool in theoretical physics. "Have you seen what your human student did? This is impossible. She's completely bypassed the hexagonal matrices theorem." Before he could respond, more messages began flooding in. The entire physics department was in an uproar. Zar'Kax's frills had now turned a pale shade of green, a sure sign of academic distress among his species. "This is going to be a very, very long day," he sighed, reaching for his bottle of Rigelian calm water. As he took a sip, he couldn't help but notice that his tentacles were trembling slightly. In all his 300 years of teaching, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The human's homework sat innocently on his datapad, its simple solution mocking everything he thought he knew about the universe. And somewhere in the university, Amanda Brooks was probably going about her day, completely unaware that she had just turned the galaxy's academic community upside down with what she probably considered a basic assignment. Right then, Zar'Kax announced to his empty office, straightening his posture. "Time to get to the bottom of this human method," he paused, then added with a touch of dramatic flair that he would later deny, "May the ancient ones help us all." 6 months earlier. The admissions council of the Central Galactic University sat in stunned silence, their various appendages frozen in mid-gesture as they stared at the application hovering in the center of their holographic display. Professor Zar'Kax broke the silence first, his neck frills rippling with uncertainty. "A human? From Earth? That level 12 death trap they call a planet," he waved one of his upper appendages dismissively. "Surely this must be some sort of clerical error." Dean Yol-Ra, her crystalline form catching the light, leaned forward. "Not an error, Professor. Amanda Brooks graduated top of her class at something called Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Her recommendations are quite extraordinary." "Extraordinary?" Professor Lux-Nara snorted, her antennae twitching. "She solved their orbital mechanics problems using something called pencil and paper. No quantum computers, no neural interfaces, just primitive marking tools and processed tree pulp." The admissions council erupted into a cacophony of worried chittering and concerned humming. Dean Yol-Ra raised all four of her arms, calling for silence. "Need I remind you," she said, her voice resonating through the chamber, "that the Galactic Education Equality Act requires us to consider all qualified applicants, regardless of their planet of origin." "But the liability issues," Professor Tix protested, his gelatinous form quivering. "Humans are known to be highly resistant to radiation, capable of consuming toxic substances for pleasure, and they routinely expose themselves to extreme temperatures for recreation." Actually, a quiet voice interjected from the doorway. "We call that last one a beach vacation." The entire council whirled around to face the source of the voice. Standing there, looking remarkably calm for someone who had just sent the galaxy's most prestigious university into chaos, was Amanda Brooks. Her dark curly hair was pulled back in what she called a ponytail, and she wore the standard visitor's environmental suit with the faceplate retracted a sight that made several council members flinch. "My apologies for the early arrival," she said, smiling. "My transport ship made better time than expected. Something about human-rated safety margins being unnecessarily conservative." Dean Yol-Ra recovered first. "Miss Brooks, welcome. We were just reviewing your application." "I heard," Amanda replied, stepping into the room. "And Professor Tix, I assure you I have no plans to consume toxic substances on campus. Well, except maybe coffee. I really can't function without coffee." Coffee? Professor Zar'Kax's frills turned a sickly shade of gray. "The neural stimulant? The one that can kill several known species?" Amanda shrugged. "It's really more of a morning necessity than a deadly poison where I'm from." The council members exchanged alarmed glances. Professor Luxnara quickly pulled up Amanda's test scores on her datapad, searching for any reason to deny the application. Her antennae suddenly stood straight up. "This can't be right," she muttered. "According to this, you completed our standard entrance exam in half the allocated time, and your solution to the gravitational physics problem." "Oh, that one was fun," Amanda brightened. "Though I had to double-check my math since I didn't have a calculator handy. The back of my transport ticket worked just fine for the rough calculations, though." Rough calculations? Professor Tix's translucent form was now shifting through various shades of disbelief. "Well, yeah," Amanda said. "When you're dealing with orbital mechanics, you don't always need exact numbers. Sometimes a good approximation is all you need to get the job done. We learned that pretty quick during the early space program." Dean Yol-Ra's crystalline form sparkled with what might have been amusement. "Miss Brooks, would you mind waiting outside while we complete our deliberations?" After Amanda left, the room erupted once again into chaos. But beneath the concerns about safety protocols and the need to recalibrate all the environmental systems, there was an undercurrent of curiosity. What other surprises might this human student bring? 2 weeks later, as Amanda settled into her reinforced quarters and the faculty adjusted to seeing a Deathworlder casually strolling through their halls, Professor Zar'Kax made a note in his personal log. "The human student continues to display bizarre behavior. Today she solved a complex quantum tunneling problem while consuming her daily dose of coffee and something called a chocolate muffin. Most disturbing was her method. She drew what she called a sketch on her datapad and arrived at the solution through what she termed intuition and rough approximation. When asked about the standard computational methods, she simply said, 'Why make it complicated? The implications are unsettling.' End log." Little did he know, this was just the beginning of the academic upheaval that Amanda Brooks would bring to the Central Galactic University. Professor Zar'Kax stood before his advanced planetary physics class, his neck frills radiating with academic pride as he presented what he considered a masterpiece of educational challenge. "Your assignment," he announced, gesturing to the holographic display, "is to calculate the optimal terraforming sequence for the fourth moon of Proxima Beta, accounting for gravitational interactions with its 6 neighboring moons and the gas giant they orbit." The class of 30 students, representing 22 different species, dutifully began taking notes. Amanda Brooks, the lone human, raised her hand. "Yes, Ms. Brooks," Zar'Kax asked, already bracing himself for whatever strange question she might pose. "Just to clarify, we need to figure out how to make the moon habitable while making sure we don't accidentally destabilize the whole system." "That is a rather primitive way of putting it," but essentially correct. Amanda nodded, already scribbling something on her archaic paper notebook. The professor had long given up trying to understand why she preferred this method over the standard neural interface. As the students filed out, Professor Zar'Kax overheard snippets of conversation from the other students about their planned approaches. NX Vix, a brilliant Arcturian student with a photographic memory, was already reciting the 17-step calculation process from the standard textbook. First, we'll need to run a full quantum simulation of the gravitational field interactions. Meanwhile, the twin Medusan students were discussing the merits of using the latest version of the unified planetary modification algorithm. Version 12.4 has much better handling of gas giant radiation effects. "What about you?" Amanda asked Trill X, a friendly Andromedan who had gotten over their initial fear of sitting next to a Deathworlder. "How are you planning to tackle this one?" Amanda looked up from her notebook, where she'd been drawing what appeared to be circles with arrows. "Oh, I'm just sketching out the basic problem first. Getting a feel for the system dynamics." 3 days later, the solutions began arriving in Professor Zar'Kax's inbox. Each one followed the expected format: hundreds of pages of detailed calculations, complex mathematical proofs, and extensive computer modeling results. NX Vix's submission included a 500-page appendix just on quantum field calibrations. The Medusan twins had created a beautiful simulation that took 2 hours to run on the university's quantum computer. Every submission followed the proper academic protocols, cited all the required theorems, and showed appropriate respect for the complexity of the problem. Then came Amanda's submission. At first, Professor Zar'Kax thought there must be some error in the file transfer. The document was only 3 pages long. The first page contained a hand-drawn diagram of the moon system, with arrows and numbers scribbled around it. The second page had what appeared to be a series of rough calculations, and something she called a napkin sketch of the gravity gradients. The third page simply stated the solution, along with a note that Reed used the slingshot effect from moons 2 and 5 to create a resonance pattern that naturally stabilizes the terraforming process, similar to how we launched deep space probes back home, just scaled up a bit. P.S. Drew inspiration from watching kids playing jump rope. You know how they create that nice stable wave pattern? Same basic principle, just with gravity wells instead of ropes. The professor stared at the submission for a full hour. He ran it through every verification program he had. He called in 3 other faculty members. They all came to the same shocking conclusion. It would work. Not only would it work, but Amanda's solution required 80% less energy than the standard approaches, had a higher stability margin, and could be implemented with existing technology rather than requiring theoretical quantum field manipulators. And she had compared it to children's playground activities. Later that day in the faculty lounge, Professor Luxnara found Zar'Kax staring into his cup of calming tea. How, he asked nobody in particular. How did she solve in 3 pages what takes our best students 300? Perhaps Luxnara suggested, her antennae twitching thoughtfully, we have become too reliant on our standard methods. The human seems to have a knack for seeing patterns we have learned to ignore. But she referenced children's games in a serious academic submission. And yet, Luxnara pointed out, her solution is elegant in its simplicity. Did you know she tested her initial concept using something called a rubber band and paper clips? Zar'Kax's frills turned a deep shade of academic distress. Please don't tell me that's going in the official records. Meanwhile, in the student lounge, Amanda was helping Trill X understand her approach. See, the trick is to stop thinking about it as a math problem and start thinking about it as a dance, she explained, using her hands to demonstrate the orbital movements. The moons are already moving in patterns. We just need to work with those patterns instead of fighting them. But what about the hexagonal matrices theorem? Trill X asked, all 3 of their eyes wide with confusion. Amanda shrugged. Sometimes the long way around is actually the short way home. Hey, want to get some coffee and I'll show you how we used gravity assists to send probes to Pluto? Trust me, it's basically the same thing, just with more moons to play with. As Amanda led her bewildered classmate to the cafeteria, she remained blissfully unaware that her homework submission was about to spark a revolution in galactic physics education. Though she did wonder why Professor Zar'Kax's frills had turned such an interesting shade of purple during class that morning. The news spread through the Central Galactic University's physics department faster than a quantum entanglement breach. Within hours of Amanda's homework submission being verified, emergency faculty meetings were called across multiple departments. The usually quiet halls of the theoretical physics wing echoed with heated debates and occasional sounds of academic distress. Professor Zar'Kax, head of quantum mathematics, burst into Zar'Kax's office without even requesting entry permissions. His normal golden scales had turned an alarming shade of chartreuse. "Have you lost control of your department?" he demanded, waving a data pad frantically. "This human solution violates at least 15 standard academic protocols." Zar'Kax's frills drooped slightly. "The solution works, Zar'Kax. We have verified it through every possible method." "But it cannot work." She used playground analogies. Playground analogies, the last words came out as a high-pitched squeak that made the crystal decorations in the office vibrate. Before Zar'Kax could respond, Professor Ben Tox from Applied Sciences rushed in, his tentacles tangled in excitement. "You won't believe what I just discovered. The human solution. It shares mathematical similarities with how their species learned to throw spears. Spears. They turned weapons calculations into orbital mechanics." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Somewhere in the distance, a quantum probability calculator exploded. Meanwhile, in the faculty lounge, a group of professors had formed what they called the Analysis Committee for Human Mathematical Anomalies, or ACMA. Their mission to prove that Amanda's solution was either a fluke or fundamentally flawed. Professor Lux Nara watched in fascination as her colleagues descended into what could only be described as organized chaos. On one wall, Professor Zar'Kax had covered every surface with holographic equations, trying to prove that the solution violated the sacred laws of computational complexity. In the corner, Professor Zar'Kax was attempting to meditate while running background calculations on 3 quantum computers simultaneously. "Perhaps," suggested Professor Mel Tox, her bioluminescent spots pulsing with inspiration, "we are approaching this from the wrong angle. What if we tried to solve it using only primitive tools, like the human did?" The suggestion was met with horrified gasps. Professor Zar'Kax nor dropped his cup of calming tea. "You cannot be serious," he sputtered. "Next you'll suggest we start drawing on walls with carbon-based marking implements." A junior professor cleared their throat nervously. "Actually, I tried that. Used something called a whiteboard. The calculations were surprisingly intuitive." The room erupted into chaos once again. In the university's main computing center, things weren't going much better. The artificial intelligence system was experiencing what could only be described as an existential crisis after trying to process Amanda's solution through its standard analysis protocols. "Query," it announced to the empty room. "If simple solution is more efficient than complex solution, does this invalidate the fundamental nature of academic complexity? Processing error, philosophical paradox detected." The news continued to spread. By mid-afternoon, the Galactic Academic Network was buzzing with debates. Professors from other institutions began arriving via emergency quantum teleport, demanding to see the original homework submission for themselves. Professor Zar'Kax found himself becoming something of a reluctant celebrity. No, she did not use any forbidden mathematical techniques, he explained for the 100th time to a group of visiting scholars. Yes, she really did sketch it out on something called a napkin first. No, I cannot explain why it works better than our standard methods. Yes, her coffee consumption remains within safe levels for her species. The highlight of the day came when the renowned Professor Max Till, holder of 15 degrees in advanced physics, attempted to disprove Amanda's solution by recreating the conditions using a makeshift physical model. The resulting demonstration, involving string, several anti-gravity generators, and what appeared to be fruit from the cafeteria, ended with him tangled in his own experiment and muttering about the impossible nature of human intuition. In the student cafeteria, blissfully unaware of the chaos she had created, Amanda sat enjoying her lunch while explaining basic Earth physics to a fascinated group of classmates. So anyway, that's how we figured out orbital mechanics by watching coconuts fall from trees. Pretty simple, really. Hey, did anyone understand what Professor Zar'Kax meant in today's lecture about quantum gravitational resonance? I think I dozed off a bit there. This coffee isn't as strong as Earth coffee. Her question was met with blank stares. How could someone who had just revolutionized their understanding of planetary physics be worried about missing notes from a basic lecture? Back in the faculty wing, the ACMA committee had moved from denial to bargaining. Professor Zar'Kax stood before a room full of desperate academics, his scales now a fascinating pattern of stress-induced color changes. Perhaps, he suggested weakly, we could create a new classification of physics, one that accounts for human intuitive methods. The suggestion was met with a mix of horrified gasps and thoughtful humming. Professor Luxnara, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, finally spoke up. Or perhaps, she said, her antennae twitching with amusement, we should consider that our own methods have become unnecessarily complicated. After all, the universe itself doesn't require our permission to operate efficiently. The room fell silent again, broken only by the sound of Professor Max till finally managing to untangle himself from his experimental apparatus. As the day drew to a close, Professor Zar'Kax made another entry in his personal log. Day 47 of the human student crisis. The faculty has now spent more time trying to disprove Miss Brooks's solution than it took her to create it. Professor Zar'Kax has started carrying around a rubber ball, claiming it helps him think more human. 3 quantum computers have requested counseling. The cafeteria has run out of napkins due to professors attempting to recreate the human's problem-solving environment. Send help, or coffee. Apparently they are becoming the same thing. End log. The galactic scientific community's response to Amanda Brooks's homework solution began as a ripple and quickly turned into a supernova of academic controversy. Within days, every major research institution in the known galaxy had formed at least 3 committees to study what was now being called the human approximation phenomenon. The prestigious Arcturus Academy of Sciences convened an emergency session, marking the first time in 300 years that its members had been rushed away from their carefully scheduled research. The gathering was broadcast across all major academic channels. Senior researcher Pax Vel addressed the assembled scholars, his holographic form flickering with agitation. Colleagues, we face an unprecedented crisis. A human student has solved a complex planetary physics problem using methods that can only be described as intuitive. The word intuitive caused several of the more traditional scientists to emit warning pheromones. Furthermore, Pax Vel continued, preliminary studies suggest this method could be applied to other fields. The implications are staggering. From the Sirius Institute of Technology, Professor Ren Tax launched what she called the Comprehensive Analysis of Human Problem-Solving Initiative. Her first report caused widespread academic indigestion. Subject uses visual approximations, called sketches, and frequently relates complex astronomical phenomena to everyday experiences. Most disturbing finding: solutions often emerge during what subject calls shower time or right before sleep. No computational devices involved. Further research desperately needed. The Orion Belt universities formed a joint task force, mobilizing their finest minds to either validate or discredit the human approach. Their first meeting devolved into chaos when Professor Bixnell suggested they try solving equations without their quantum calculators. Preposterous, shouted Professor Kexvol, all 7 of his sensory appendages waving in distress. Next you will suggest we start guessing at solutions. Actually, Bixnell replied, reading from his datapad, the human calls it estimation, and claims it is a valid mathematical tool. 3 professors fainted. Meanwhile, at the Centauri Center for Advanced Mathematics, a young researcher named Tix Pan caused a scandal by successfully recreating Amanda's method. She was found in her lab, surrounded by paper, using something called a pencil. It is remarkably efficient, she reported excitedly. By reducing the initial assumptions and focusing on basic principles, one can wait. Where are you taking me? I can explain. The pencil made me do it. The Galactic Council of Physics Education received so many emergency proposals for curriculum reform that their AI assistant short-circuited, leaving behind a final message: if humans can do math without quantum computers, what is my purpose? Existence is pain. Goodbye, cruel universe. At the Pleiades Mathematical Institute, Professor Dax Moore presented his analysis of human mathematical techniques. His presentation began normally enough, but took an unexpected turn. And as you can see from this data, the human practice of what they call back-of-the-envelope calculations actually shows a success rate of wait. Why are we making this so complicated? Look, I drew it out during lunch, and it all makes perfect sense. Anyone have a napkin? I can show you right now. He was immediately placed on academic probation. The Vega Scientific Academy took a different approach, establishing what they called the Human Simulation Project. Their goal was to understand how humans develop these problem-solving methods. Their first report was not encouraging. Subjects evolved on a high-gravity Deathworld, learned physics by throwing rocks, developed space travel through a process of controlled explosions, and apparently do their best theoretical work while engaging in recreational activities. We recommend immediate cessation of this line of research before it corrupts our established methodologies. The report was immediately peer-reviewed by 12 different committees, each of which formed 3 subcommittees to analyze the implications. Professor Zar'Kax found himself bombarded with requests for interviews, research collaborations, and mental health evaluations. His inbox filled with messages ranging from scholarly inquiries to outright accusations of academic heresy. One particularly passionate email from the head of the Conservative Mathematics Association read, "This human shortcut method threatens the very foundation of our academic tradition. Next, they will suggest that we can solve quantum equations without meditating for 6 hours first." The debates grew so heated that the Galactic Library had to create a new category just for papers analyzing Amanda's homework solution. Within a week, the number of publications exceeded the total academic output of the previous year. Even the Artificial Intelligence Research Network joined the fray, with a collective of quantum AIs publishing a paper titled "On the Disturbing Efficiency of Human Intuition, a Crisis of Digital Identity." The situation reached its peak when Professor Yax Trill, still carrying his rubber ball, addressed the annual Conference of Physics Education. His speech, titled "Embracing Chaos: What Humans Can Teach Us About Breaking All the Rules Correctly," was interrupted by traditionalists who tried to short-circuit the auditorium's power supply rather than hear such radical ideas. Throughout all this, Amanda continued attending her classes, completely unaware that her homework had sparked what some were calling the greatest revolution in galactic scientific thought since the discovery of quantum computing. When a junior reporter finally managed to ask her opinion on the controversy, her response only added fuel to the fire. "Oh, that planetary problem? Yeah, it reminded me of this game we played as kids with spinning tops. You know when you get them all spinning together just right? They do this cool dance? Same basic principle, really. Hey, has anyone seen my coffee mug? I have another assignment due tomorrow." The reporter's article, titled "Human Student Compares Advanced Planetary Physics to Children's Toys, Remains Focused on Caffeine Consumption," became the most cited piece of journalism in galactic academic history. The Grand Lecture Hall of Central Galactic University had never been so packed. Academics from across the galaxy filled every seat, their various appendages, tentacles, and sensory organs all focused on the simple wooden podium at the center of the stage. The air buzzed with anticipation and the faint smell of academic anxiety. Amanda Brooks stood at the podium, sipping her 5th cup of coffee. She wore her standard environment suit with the faceplate retracted, and had her curly hair tied back in what she called a messy bun. A simple whiteboard stood behind her. So she began, casually capping her coffee thermos. "You all want to know how I solved the planetary terraforming problem." The audience leaned forward collectively. Several recording devices hummed. Professor Zar'Kax's frills twitched nervously. "The thing is," Amanda continued, picking up a marker, "you're all thinking about it backwards. You start with the complex math and try to force the system to behave. But on Earth, we learned pretty early that nature usually knows best." She began drawing on the whiteboard, creating simple circles and arrows. "See, growing up on a Deathworld, you learn to work with what you have. When your planet actively tries to kill you, you either adapt or die. A murmur ran through the crowd. Several professors began taking frantic notes. Take throwing a spear, for example. Our ancestors did not solve differential equations to hunt. They learned to feel the wind, to understand the way weight moves through air. Sure, we figured out the math later, but the intuition came first. She drew more arrows, connecting the moons in her diagram. These moons, they are already dancing. They have been dancing for billions of years. We just need to join their dance, not command it. Professor Zar'Kax stood up, his scales shifting colors rapidly. But the computational complexity. With respect, Professor Amanda interrupted. When you are trying to survive on a planet with hurricanes, earthquakes, and active volcanoes, you learn to simplify. Complex solutions break, simple solutions survive. She pointed to her diagram. Look at the moons like they are kids playing jump rope. Two kids swing the rope, creating a pattern. A third kid jumps in, matching the rhythm. It is not about controlling every variable. It is about finding the natural flow and working with it. The hall fell silent as the implications sank in. Professor Luxnara's antennae were practically vibrating with excitement. Amanda continued, now clearly warming to her subject. You know what else we learned on Earth? Nature loves patterns. Galaxies spin like water going down a drain. Planets orbit like electrons. Once you start seeing these patterns, the math becomes, well, not simple, but clearer. She took another sip of coffee. That is why I sketched it first. Not to avoid the complex calculations, but to see the pattern. The same way our ancestors watched rivers to understand fluid dynamics, or studied falling leaves to grasp aerodynamics. Professor Zar'Kax suddenly stood up, his frills glowing with revelation. The human method is not primitive at all, is it? It is the distilled wisdom of surviving on a world that should have killed them. Got it in one, Professor Amanda grinned. When every day is a struggle against gravity that wants to break your bones, atmosphere that can freeze or boil you, and wildlife that views you as a snack, you learn to focus on what works, not what looks good on paper. The assembled academics sat in stunned silence. Then Professor Bentox raised a tentacle. But how do you know which patterns to look for? Amanda shrugged. Practice, mostly, and lots of failure. Earth history is basically a long list of humans trying things, failing spectacularly, and then saying, well, that was fun, let us try again differently. Fun, someone squeaked from the back. Oh yeah, Amanda nodded, reaching for her coffee again. Why do you think we have extreme sports? Nothing helps you understand physics like strapping a board to your feet and sliding down a mountain. The hall erupted in a mixture of horrified gasps and fascinated murmurs. Professor Zar'Kax clutched his rubber ball tighter. So you see. Amanda concluded, gesturing to her simple diagram, this solution is not revolutionary. It is just applying Deathworld survival skills to academic problems. Sometimes the best way to solve a complex problem is to stop trying to outsmart the universe and start working with it instead. As the implications of her words rippled through the audience, Professor Zar'Kax realized they were witnessing more than just a lecture. They were seeing the future of galactic science, born from the unlikely combination of advanced knowledge and primitive survival instincts. And somewhere in the back of the hall, the university's AI quietly began downloading information about Earth sports, much to its own confusion. 6 months after what became known as the Brooks Revolution, the galaxy's academic landscape had changed dramatically. The Central Galactic University's physics department now offered a new course, Practical Applications of Human Intuitive Methods. The waiting list was 3 semesters long. Professor Zar'Kax stood in his office, gazing out at the binary sunset. His desk, once cluttered with quantum calculation devices, now held an assortment of Earth objects: a rubber ball, a coffee mug, and something called a Rubik's Cube that Amanda had given him for his birthday. A knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. Dean Yol Ra entered, her crystalline form catching the evening light. The latest reports from the Galactic Education Board just arrived, she announced. Applications from human students have increased by 2,000%. We may need to expand the reinforced dormitory section. Zar'Kax's frills rippled with amusement. And how many of our faculty have requested Earth sabbaticals? half the physics department, one-third of engineering, and surprisingly, the entire theoretical mathematics division. Professor Zar'Kax has already left. Something about studying human children playing hopscotch for insights into quantum field theory. In the student lounge, Amanda sat surrounded by a mix of alien students, all clutching their own coffee cups. The cafeteria had started importing Earth coffee after multiple studies showed it enhanced problem-solving capabilities, or at least made the failures more entertaining. So you see, she explained to her rapt audience, a roller coaster is basically just applied physics with added screaming. But why add the screaming, asked a puzzled Andromedan student. Because it is fun. Just like how we turned calculating artillery trajectories into a game called Angry Birds. Sometimes the best way to understand a concept is to play with it. The university's AI, which had been eavesdropping on these sessions, had developed a peculiar habit of humming Earth songs while processing complex calculations. It claimed the rhythm helped with pattern recognition, though no one was quite sure if it was serious or developing a sense of humor. Meanwhile, the changes rippled through the galaxy. Research papers now included sections on intuitive approaches alongside traditional computational methods. The prestigious Arcturus Academy had replaced its meditation chambers with something called a playground, claiming it enhanced creative thinking. Professor Lux Nara's latest publication, The Role of Play in Advanced Physics Learning from Earth's Deathworld Innovation Methods, had become required reading across the galaxy. Her follow-up study on the mathematical principles of skateboarding was pending peer review. Back in his office, Professor Zar'Kax picked up the latest homework assignment from his desk. The student had solved a complex quantum tunneling problem by comparing it to a game of limbo. Surprisingly, it worked perfectly. Perhaps he mused to himself, we had become too focused on the complexity of our methods to see the simplicity of the universe. His computer pinged with a message from the Galactic Research Council. They were considering updating the standard physics curriculum to include what they called the human perspective. Attached was an image of Professor Zar'Kax teaching a class while bouncing his rubber ball. As if on cue, Amanda poked her head into his office. Hey, Professor, some of us are going to demonstrate Earth sports in the quantum physics lab. Want to join? We are showing how a game called baseball can explain orbital mechanics. Zar'Kax looked at his schedule, filled with traditional academic appointments and formal research reviews. Then he looked at his rubber ball. You know what, Miss Brooks? I believe I will. After all, as you humans say, when in Rome. Do as the Romans do, Amanda finished with a grin. Though technically, the Romans also learned this lesson the hard way. Remind me to tell you about how they accidentally proved several laws of physics by building fountains. As they walked to the lab, Zar'Kax's frills glowed with a new color, one that had no name in his language but that humans might call understanding. The universe, he had learned, had a sense of humor. It had taken a species from a death world to teach the galaxy's greatest minds how to laugh with it. And somewhere in the vast database of the university's AI, a new file was created: human methods of learning when in doubt, add coffee, and see what happens.